Every Sunday, I took my daughter swimming together. Meanwhile, my husband would go to the gym. But one day, my daughter whispered to me, "Mom, Dad never actually works out." I was shocked. So the following Sunday, I decided to secretly follow my husband, and what I discovered left me utterly stunned. It turned out that before the story begins, please write in the comments where you're watching this story from. Don't forget to like and subscribe so the Midnight Tales channel can continue to grow and bring you even more gripping stories. The warm rays of the morning sun filtered through the bedroom curtains, signaling that Sunday had arrived. For many people, Sunday was a day to sleep in and be lazy, but not for the small family of Clara. In that cozy house, Sundays followed a fixed routine that had gone uninterrupted for the past 2 years. Clara had been awake since dawn, completed her morning prayers, and was now busy in the kitchen preparing a simple yet nutritious breakfast for her husband and daughter. She stirred a pot of chicken porridge, its savory aroma filling the entire kitchen, while occasionally glancing at the wall clock. Time seemed to pass quickly when the heart was content, and Clara truly felt like the luckiest woman in the world. She had a comfortable home, a bright little daughter named Lucy, and a handsome husband who appeared deeply committed to his health, Brian. Brian emerged from the bedroom looking refreshed after his morning shower. He was dressed in full workout attire, long training pants and a moisture-wicking shirt hugging his fit physique. A large gym bag packed with equipment was slung over his shoulder. Brian often said that health was the most valuable long-term investment. That is why every Sunday morning until noon, he faithfully went to a fitness center downtown. Clara fully supported this habit. In fact, she felt proud to have a husband who was disciplined about maintaining his stamina and physique. Unlike the husbands of many of her friends whose bellies had begun to grow with age. Clara placed the bowls of porridge on the dining table and greeted her husband with a sincere, warm smile. That morning unfolded like a well-rehearsed script. They ate breakfast together, chatting lightly about plans for the upcoming week or Lucy's amusing stories from kindergarten. Lucy sat in her high chair, eating eagerly while excitedly talking about her funny classmates. Brian listened patiently, occasionally stroking her daughter's head affectionately. To Clara, this scene was the very definition of perfection. No arguments, no raised voices, just family warmth. After breakfast, Brian stood up and picked up his gym bag, his silent signal that it was time to part ways for the morning. Their Sundays were always divided this way. Brian would head to the gym in the city for heavy weight training, which he claimed wasn't suitable for children. Meanwhile, Clara would take Lucy to a public swimming pool designed to help kids develop their motor skills. Brian approached Clara and gently kissed her forehead, lingering for a moment. The fresh scent of his body wash filled Clara's senses. He whispered that he planned to train hard that day to burn off last night's dinner. Clara laughed softly and encouraged him. Then Brian turned to Lucy, crouched down to her level, and kissed her chubby cheek. He reminded her to listen to his mom and not be naughty at the pool. Lucy nodded obediently, clutching her favorite rubber toy. Once the farewell ritual was complete, Brian walked confidently to his car, waving one last time before the engine roared and disappeared down the street. Clara watched until the car vanished around the corner, then hurried to prepare Lucy's swimming gear. The drive to the pool was filled with Lucy's cheerful singing. Clara drove calmly, imagining how healthy their family was, her husband working out, her daughter swimming, and herself staying active. At the pool, the atmosphere was lively with other families. Clara helped Lucy change clothes, put floaties on her arms, and guided her into the shallow children's pool. The water felt cool and clear that morning. Lucy squealed with joy as her feet touched the water. Clara patiently taught Lucy how to kick her legs and hold her breath. Lucy's carefree laughter warmed Clara's heart. Watching her daughter happy made all the fatigue from household duties and side jobs feel worthwhile. Clara was a protective mother, but she also allowed her child to explore. She didn't sit by the pool scrolling on her phone. She joined Lucy in the water, staying close at all times. Yet something felt different that day. Between her laughter, Lucy occasionally fell silent, staring blankly toward the pool entrance as if pondering something far too heavy for a 5-year-old. Clara asked if she was tired or hungry, but Lucy only shook her head and resumed playing. Clara assumed it was just a fleeting mood. As the sun climbed higher and the heat intensified, Clara decided it was time to wrap up. Lucy agreed without protest. They headed to the women's changing room, filled with the sound of running showers and conversations among other mothers. Clara carefully bathed Lucy, washing away chlorine from her soft skin and hair. Afterwards, once they were dressed, Clara seated Lucy in front of a large mirror and gently dried her long hair with a towel. That was when everything changed. Clara was softly rubbing Lucy's hair when she noticed her reflection. Lucy wasn't smiling. Her wide eyes met Clara's in the mirror, serious in a way that felt unnatural. Clara stopped and asked gently, "What is it, sweetheart?" Lucy turned to face her, reached up, and tugged lightly at the edge of Clara's shawl, pulling her closer. Clara bent down, expecting a whispered request for ice cream or a new toy. Instead, Lucy spoke softly, almost like a breath of wind, but her words struck Clara's heart with a crushing force. She said that Dad never actually worked out. Clara froze, trying to process it. She laughed nervously, assuming Lucy was confused. She explained that Dad went to a place where people lifted heavy weights. Of course that was exercise. But Lucy shook her head firmly. Her gaze was steady, pure, and unwavering. Lucy continued with details that sent a cold shiver through Clara's veins. She said that Dad's clothes never smelled sweaty or sour like Uncle Ryan's after playing soccer. Dad's clothes always smelled nice, just like the soap used by Aunt Sandra, whom Lucy had visited with Dad before. Lucy remembered the scent clearly, she said, because it smelled sweet, like vanilla cake. Clara's heart seemed to stop. The name Sandra flashed through her mind like lightning. Sandra was an old acquaintance, someone Clara hadn't seen in years. How could Lucy know Sandra's soap? And when had Brian taken Lucy to Sandra's house without her knowledge? Clara held Lucy by the shoulders, struggling to steady her trembling hands. "When did Dad take you to Aunt Sandra?" she asked, her voice shaking. Lucy thought for a moment, then answered innocently. It happened several times when Mom was out shopping or attending social gatherings. Dad said they were just stopping to buy gas, but instead they went to a big house with a swing. She was told to wait in the car and play games on Dad's phone. But once she needed to use the bathroom and went inside, where she smelled that familiar scent in the restroom. Lucy's calm, detailed explanation shattered the wall of certainty Clara had built around her marriage. No 5-year-old could fabricate a story that precise, down to scents and locations. The world spun. The noise in the changing room faded into a dull ringing. Clara pulled Lucy into a tight embrace, hiding her pale face against her small shoulder. She didn't want Lucy to see the fear in her eyes. In that moment, Clara realized that the perfect Sunday routine she cherished concealed a gaping hole. Lucy's whisper wasn't childish chatter. It was the key to a Pandora's box long sealed in her marriage. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. She needed to go home. She needed to find out whether Lucy's words were true or just a misunderstanding. But deep down, a wife's instinct was screaming that something was terribly wrong. The drive home felt longer than ever. Clara's thoughts were in chaos as Lucy slept peacefully beside her, exhausted from swimming. She tried to think logically. Maybe Lucy had mistaken someone else. Maybe the Sandra Lucy mentioned wasn't the same Sandra she knew. Maybe Brian had simply stopped by briefly for business. She clung to every rational explanation she could find. Brian was a good husband. He was never harsh, always came home timely during weekdays, and provided for the family, even if modestly. Surely he wouldn't betray her.
The house was still quiet. Brian usually didn't come home until 1 or 2 in the afternoon, claiming he often stopped for a healthy lunch with his gym buddies before relaxing in the sauna. Clara carried Lucy, who was still fast asleep, into her bedroom. She tucked her in carefully and stared at her daughter's peaceful face. A wave of guilt crept into her chest. Had she been too naive all this time? Too consumed by household routines to notice what her husband was really doing out there? Clara left Lucy's room and sat alone in the living room. The silence that once felt comforting now pressed down on her like a threat. The ticking of the wall clock sounded like a countdown to an explosion. At 12:15 p.m., the low rumble of Brian's car echoed as it pulled into the garage. Clara's heart began racing again. She took a deep breath, forced the best smile she could manage, and stood by the front door to greet her husband. Brian entered with dragging steps, as if his legs were unbearably heavy. His face was carefully arranged to look exhausted. He immediately complained that today was leg day, the most brutal workout of the week. He spoke animatedly about the heavy weights he had lifted, about his trainer pushing him through extra repetitions, about muscles screaming for mercy. Brian's performance was flawless, or at least it used to be. Clara listened while studying him with a new gaze, the gaze of an investigator. She examined his face. Clean, not oily, not dull like someone who had spent hours sweating in a crowded gym. His hair was neatly styled, not flat or damp. But Brian always showered at the gym before coming home. That was a solid alibi. Clara offered him a glass of cold water. Brian accepted it with a weak nod, as if truly dehydrated. As he drank, Clara stepped closer, pretending to massage his shoulders. That's when she smelled it. Faint, very subtle, masked by Brian's usual cologne. A soft, sweet scent. Vanilla. Brian set the empty glass down and said he wanted to shower again at home so he could feel fresher before taking a nap. He left his black gym bag lying casually on the living room sofa and walked toward the bathroom. Clara waited until she heard the bathroom door lock and the water running. Then, moving quickly but carefully, she approached the gym bag. Her hands trembled as they touched the zipper. She felt like a thief in her own home, violating her husband's privacy. But this doubt had to be answered. She slowly opened the zipper, holding her breath to avoid making any sound. Inside were neatly stacked clothes, a workout shirt, shorts, a towel, and a protein shaker bottle. At first glance, everything looked normal. But Clara was a meticulous homemaker. She knew the difference between worn clothes and clean ones. She picked up the shirt Brian supposedly wore during his intense workout. It was completely dry. There was no trace of moisture in the fabric. She brought it closer to her nose. There should have been sweat, a sour scent, at least a mix of detergent and tired body odor. There was nothing. The shirt smelled like closet freshener, the exact same scent it had when Clara folded and packed it into the bag that morning. Even worse, the ironed creases were still sharp and intact along the sleeves and back. She checked the shorts. The same. Clean, dry, perfectly pressed. The factory folds were still visible. No one could possibly squat or run on a treadmill in these without leaving the slightest trace. She moved on to the towel. Bone dry, soft, warm. If Brian had showered at the gym, the towel should have been damp, at least cool from being sealed in a plastic bag. But this towel had never been used. Then came the worst part, the shaker bottle. Clara unscrewed the lid. The bottle was dry, clean, no smell of milk or protein powder, no water stains inside. It hadn't been used at all. Clara collapsed on the living room floor. The bag was silent evidence, screaming the truth. Brian had never changed his clothes. Brian had never worked out. Brian had never showered at the gym. Every story about leg day, heavy weights, and a strict trainer was nothing but a carefully rehearsed lie. He had carried this bag out of the house that morning, left it untouched in his car or somewhere else, and brought it back home in the exact same condition. Tears fell one by one, soaking the shirt clenched in Clara's hands. The pain wasn't just from being lied to, but from realizing how meticulously Brian had planned this deception every week. The sound of the bathroom door opening jolted her back to reality. Panicking, Clara quickly folded the clothes haphazardly, shoved them back into the bag, zipped it closed, and stood up. She wiped her tears and pretended to straighten the sofa cushions. Brian emerged with only a towel wrapped around his waist, humming softly. He didn't notice Clara's panic. He walked casually past her toward the bedroom, saying he was hungry and asking her to prepare lunch. That casual tone cut deeper than any accusation. How could someone act so normal after lying to his wife and child all day? At lunch, Clara served Brian as usual. She scooped rice, poured soup, and arranged the side dishes on his plate. Inside her chest, a storm raged. She watched Brian eat enthusiastically. She wanted to scream, to dump the contents of the gym bag on the table and demand the truth. But logic stopped her. If she confronted him now, Brian would dodge it with 1,000 excuses. He was skilled with words. She needed stronger proof than dry clothes. She needed to see with her own eyes where Brian actually went. Lucy's puzzle pieces began to fit together. The big house with a swing, Aunt Sandra, the vanilla scent, and the untouched gym bag. Clara realized she wasn't dealing with ordinary marital neglect. This was a structured betrayal. Brian laughed while watching a funny video on his phone, carefree and unburdened. Clara swore. Silently. That laughter wouldn't last. Next Sunday, she wouldn't stay silent. Next Sunday, she would prove the truth behind Lucy's words, even if that truth shattered her heart beyond repair. She would follow Brian wherever his car went. A week passed after the discovery of the pristine gym bag. For Clara, those 7 days felt like 7 torturous years. She moved through her days like a robot, doing chores, caring for Lucy, wearing a perfectly arranged fake smile. Every time Brian came home from work and kissed her cheek, Clara had to suppress the sudden wave of nausea rising in her stomach. She observed him more closely now, how Brian smiled at his phone screen, then quickly locked it when she approached, how he often claimed to take client calls on the front porch late into the night. The signs had always been there, but Clara's sincere trust had blinded her. Now the veil had been lifted, and Clara was ready to face the painful truth. Sunday morning came again. The sun shone brightly, as if mocking the darkness consuming Clara's heart. According to the plan she had carefully constructed in her mind, Clara did not wake up early to cook that morning. Instead, she sat on the porch, her hands folded, her eyes closed. She watched Brian She stayed in bed, the blanket pulled up to her neck. When Brian woke up and saw her wife still lying there, he gently shook her shoulder. Clara opened her eyes slowly, put on a weak expression, and clutched her stomach. She complained of severe stomach pain and dizziness, perhaps food poisoning from the night before. She kept her voice faint to sound convincing. Brian appeared concerned, or at least pretended to be. He placed the back of his hand on Clara's forehead to check her temperature. Clara said she couldn't go swimming that day. She insisted Brian should still go work out. His training schedule was too important to miss. Lucy, she said, would stay at Mrs. Rose's house, just 2 blocks away. Brian casually offered to cancel his workout to take care of her, but Clara caught the flash of relief in his eyes when she refused. She firmly insisted he go. Finally, with a face made to look reluctant but steps noticeably light, he agreed. He quickly got dressed in his workout clothes and sprayed that familiar cologne again. Before leaving, he told Clara to get plenty of rest and take her medicine. The moment Brian's car disappeared from the driveway, Clara's stomach pain vanished instantly. She jumped out of bed. Adrenaline surged through her body. She quickly bathed Lucy, explaining that they would play at Grandma's house for a while because Mommy had an urgent matter. After dropping Lucy off at Mrs. Rose's house and making sure the older woman didn't ask too many questions, Clara moved to phase 2 of her plan. She didn't use the family car. Brian might recognize it from a distance. The day before, she had borrowed her younger brother's car, an old, small, dull gray sedan, common, forgettable, and perfect for surveillance. It was already parked behind Mrs. Rose's house. Clara put on oversized sunglasses and changed the way she...
Clara's suspicions were right. At the intersection that should have led toward the downtown fitness center, Brian's car suddenly turned on its right signal. Instead of heading into the city, the SUV veered toward the rapidly developing outskirts, an area filled with newly built residential neighborhoods. Clara held her breath as she turned the steering wheel, following her husband's car. The roads here were quieter, forcing her to be even more careful about keeping her distance so she wouldn't be noticed. After about 20 minutes of driving, Brian's car slowed and turned into the parking lot of a large, modern supermarket. Clara pulled over as well, parking far away in a corner of the lot, partially hidden behind a delivery truck. From there, she still had a clear view of Brian's vehicle. She watched closely. Brian didn't get out to buy drinks or food. The engine stayed running. Through the lightly tinted windows, Clara could see movement inside the car. Brian was taking off his workout shirt. Clara narrowed her eyes, focusing. He was changing clothes inside the car. Brian put on a light blue long-sleeved shirt, expensive-looking, crisp, and perfectly tailored. Then he checked himself in the rearview mirror, smoothing his hair into a sleek, polished style. It was completely different from his relaxed, casual look at home. Clara gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. The transformation happened right before her eyes. The man who had left home claiming he was going to sweat under heavy weights now looked like a young executive heading to a date or an important meeting. Once he finished adjusting his appearance, Brian drove out of the supermarket parking lot. Clara followed again. This time, her heart felt more shattered, but her certainty was absolute. Brian's charade was no small lie. He had prepared a full costume, a believable schedule, and a flawless routine. A question struck Clara's mind like a blow. Where did Brian get the money for a shirt like that? For months, Brian had claimed his finances were tight because the business he was building hadn't turned a profit yet. He often asked Clara for gas money. The fact that he owned expensive clothes hidden from her made Clara realize she had been deceived financially, not just emotionally. Brian's SUV continued deeper into a more elite area, leaving the noisy city behind. The scenery shifted into rows of palm trees and grand gated communities.
The black SUV finally slowed as it approached a magnificent entrance gate. Large golden letters were mounted on a marble wall. Rosewood Residence, a newly built luxury housing complex famous for its sky-high prices and exclusive facilities. Clara recognized it from social media advertisements, though she had never imagined her husband had any connection to a place like this. Brian stopped at the security checkpoint. Clara saw the guard greet him respectfully and lift the automatic gate without asking for identification. That meant Brian came here often, or worse, he was a resident known to security. Clara couldn't follow immediately. She waited across the street pretending to check her phone. Once Brian's car disappeared around the main curve inside the complex, Clara gathered her courage and drove up to the security post. She rolled down her window and smiled politely. With forced confidence, she said she was delivering catering to a house in Block C, number 8, an address she invented on the spot. Fortunately, the guard seemed busy and glanced at her neat professional appearance. He allowed her entry in exchange for an ID. Clara handed over an old ID card she still had in her wallet, then drove into the complex. Inside, the atmosphere was calm and pristine. Wide asphalt roads, manicured gardens on every corner, and large houses standing proudly without tall fences. Clara drove slowly, scanning for Brian's car. She didn't have to look long. At the end of the main block, she spotted his SUV parked in front of a striking two-story house. Clara stopped at a distance, hiding under the shade of a large leafy tree. She turned the engine off and stared. Her breath caught in her throat. The tears she had been holding back surged uncontrollably. That house wasn't just another luxury home. She recognized every architectural detail. The unique roof design, the large east-facing windows meant to catch the morning sun, the spacious second-floor balcony with wrought iron railings shakes like leaves, and the white wooden swing on the front porch. It was her dream house. 5 years ago, when they had just married and lived in a cramped rental, Clara had sketched her dream home in a notebook. She had shown it to Brian with sparkling eyes, dreaming that one day they would build a house like that for their children. Brian had laughed dismissively back then. He said the design was wasteful, unrealistic, and would cost millions of dollars, money they would never have. He told Clara to stop dreaming and be realistic. Now, that very sketch stood before her, real and magnificent. Brian had made Clara's dream come true, just not for her. The pain that tore through Clara's chest was far worse than discovering the lies. This was theft of a dream. Brian had stolen her vision of the future and handed it to someone else. She felt betrayed down to her bones. How could he be so cruel, building a house with a design so specifically tied to her wife's dreams, only to live in it with another woman? This was psychological cruelty at its most vicious. As Clara wrestled with the pain, the front door of the house opened. Brian stepped out, relaxed and smiling broadly, a genuine, radiant smile she hadn't seen at home in a long time. Moments later, a woman followed him. It was Sandra. She recognized her immediately, despite the years. Sandra looked fuller, well cared for, wearing a comfortable yet elegant house dress. What made Clara's eyes widen in horror was Sandra's belly. She was heavily pregnant. Brian wrapped an arm protectively around Sandra's waist and guided her toward the white swing on the porch. The same swing Clara had once dreamed of. Brian knelt before Sandra, gently stroking her swollen belly, then pressed his ear against it as if listening to the baby's heartbeat. Sandra laughed softly, running her fingers through Brian's hair. It was a perfect picture, a harmonious, happy family, ironically built upon the suffering of Clara and Lucy. Clara remembered the savings she had given Brian just last month, money he claimed was for importing goods to stabilize his business. She remembered selling her grandmother's gold jewelry a year ago to cover Brian's debts. All her sacrifices had led here. They had become the concrete pillars of this house, the swing on that porch, and the nourishment of another woman's unborn child. Her hands trembled as she grabbed her phone. She had to document this. Carefully, she zoomed in and took photo after photo. Brian kissing Sandra's forehead, the license plate of his SUV in the garage, the entire facade of the house. With each shutter click, her heart grew colder. Her tears stopped falling. Sadness crystallized into a calm, lethal rage. She watched Brian go inside briefly, then return with a glass of juice for Sandra, serving her like a queen. At home, Brian had never once fetched Clara a glass of water. Even when Clara had been sick with a high fever last month, he demanded attention, massages, meals, service. The injustice made her blood boil. In that moment, Clara realized she hadn't lost a husband. She was finally seeing the true face of the man she had married. The man laughing happily in that luxury home was a skilled actor, a heartless con artist. Clara lowered her phone once she had enough evidence. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with resolve. She wouldn't confront them now. That would only make her look hysterical and weak. Brian might run with the remaining assets, or Sandra would play the victim. No, Clara would go home, gather the shattered pieces of her heart, and forge them into a weapon. She would reclaim what was rightfully hers and Lucy's. She glanced at the dream house one last time, silently swearing that one day she would stand on that porch and Brian would be the one forced to leave. She started the car, turned around slowly, and left Rosewood residence with a plan for retribution growing in her mind. After leaving Rosewood residence, Clara didn't go home to cry into a pillow. Instead, she drove straight to the office of Harrison and Cole Law Firm, owned by Mr. Harrison, a senior attorney and longtime friend of her late father. Clara arrived not as a desperate, broken wife, but as a woman ready for war. Inside Mr. Harrison's office, surrounded by towering stacks of legal files, Clara laid out all her evidence: photographs from her phone, copies of bank statements, and the meticulous notes she had collected. Mr. Harrison looked at her with deep sympathy and quiet pride. Together, they began to dissect Brian's financial transactions one by one. The results of the investigation were shocking, even for Clara, who had braced herself for the worst. For the past 2 years, Brian had been systematically siphoning funds from the garment manufacturing business they had built together. In every report he gave Clara, he claimed the money was being used to purchase imported fabrics or to pay overdue suppliers. But bank records did not lie. The money flowed steadily into a personal account under Sandra's name. The total amount was staggering, amounting to several $1,000,000. It was used for a down payment on a luxury house, installments on an expensive SUV, designer shopping sprees, and Sandra's beauty and wellness treatments. Clara felt nauseous staring at the rows of numbers. That money was her late father's inheritance, Lucy's education savings, and the result of Clara's own hard work, robbed by her husband to please another woman. Mr. Harrison, the senior attorney, advised a tactical legal approach. He warned Clara that if she confronted Brian now, he could easily hide the remaining assets or manipulate the narrative. They needed a trap. Brian had to feel safe. He had to believe his lies were still airtight, so he would grow careless and make a fatal mistake. Clara wiped away the tears that had escaped in anger and nodded. That very day, she decided to play the greatest role of her life. She would become an actress on the stage of her own marriage. She would be the sweet, obedient, foolish wife. Exactly what Brian wanted. That evening, when Brian came home, he was greeted by the aroma of his favorite dish. Clara had cooked slow-braised beef stew, a meal that took hours to prepare. The house was spotless, warm, and fragrant. Clara welcomed him at the door with a wide smile and kissed his hand, something she hadn't done in a long time due to exhaustion from work. Brian looked surprised, but the surprise quickly turned into satisfaction. In his cunning mind, he felt triumphant, having a devoted wife at home and a beautiful mistress outside, all without being caught. He ate heartily, showering Clara with praise. Clara returned his compliments with gentle eyes, while inside she restrained a storm of rage ready to erupt. Midway through dinner, Brian began his performance. With a deliberately weary and pressured tone, he explained that his business needed an urgent cash injection. He claimed there was a major opportunity to expand operations overseas, but it required immediate capital within the week, otherwise someone else would seize it. Brian glanced at Clara, fishing for concern. Clara set her spoon down slowly and met her husband's eyes. In the past, she would have panicked, asked endless questions. This time, she smiled calmly. She said she trusted Brian completely. She said a wife's duty was to support her husband in providing for the family. Brian's face lit up instantly. He hadn't expected it to be this easy. Clara stood, walked to her desk drawer, and retrieved a document folder prepared earlier by Mr. Harrison. Inside were papers authorizing the liquidation of Lucy's education deposit, worth a significant amount. Hidden among them was a carefully worded asset transfer agreement and debt acknowledgement, wrapped in dense legal language. If Brian had read carefully, he would have realized that his signature meant he formally acknowledged borrowing Clara's personal funds and pledged all his assets, including those registered under third parties, as collateral. But Clara knew her husband well. Brian was lazy and greedy. She placed the folder in front of him along with a pen, playfully urging him to sign quickly so the money could be released the next day. Without the slightest suspicion, Brian grabbed the pen. His eyes were fixed only on the dollar amount printed on the first page. He didn't read the rest. His mind was already drifting, imagining Sandra's delighted face when he brought her the cash. Swiftly, Brian signed his name over the legal stamp. The sound of the pen scratching paper felt like victory music in Clara's ears. When Brian closed the folder with a wide grin, Clara smiled back, but her smile meant something entirely different. That signature was a death sentence to Brian's financial freedom. That night, Brian slept peacefully, dreaming of wealth. Clara stayed awake, staring at the bedroom ceiling, cold and composed. She had just locked her husband's neck in an invisible legal chain. A few days later, Clara received a call from Mr. Harrison. He had discovered something invaluable. The luxury home at Rosewood Residence where Sandra lived had serious administrative issues. Brian had fallen behind on mortgage payments to the developer for 3 consecutive months. The money meant for the house had been used by Sandra for an overseas vacation the month before. The developer was preparing a foreclosure notice, but would prefer if a third party would take over the disputed property in cash to stabilize their cash flow. This information was gold. The house was not legally owned by Sandra or Brian. Its status was still pending. Mr. Harrison explained that Clara could step in as an investor, purchasing the debt and ownership rights directly from the developer. In other words, Clara could buy the house where her husband's mistress lived without their knowledge. She did not hesitate. Clara still possessed emergency assets inherited from her grandmother, precious metals and rural land holdings that could be liquidated quickly. Brian had never known about them. Clara had deliberately kept them hidden as a family safety net. Ironically, that safety net was now being used to destroy the false family Brian had built. The purchase was executed quietly and meticulously. Clara did not use her personal name. Instead, she established a small property investment LLC with Mr. Harrison acting as legal representative. Through this shell company, Clara acquired the disputed property at Rosewood Residence. Within a week, the transaction was complete. The developer was relieved, non-performing debt resolved with a cash settlement. All legal documents were handed over to Mr. Harrison. On paper, in black and white, the lawful owner of the house Sandra lived in was now Clara's company. That afternoon, Clara sat in a cafe across from Mr. Harrison's office, holding a copy of the new ownership certificate. Her fingers traced the thick paper. Satisfaction washed over her. She had won a major battle without drawing a sword. She imagined Sandra's smug face, believing her life was safe and secure inside that grand mansion. Sandra didn't realize that she was living in the house of the legal wife of the man she stole. She slept in Clara's bedroom, cooked in Clara's kitchen, sheltered under Clara's roof. Clara felt like a shadow, owning everything while remaining unseen. A shadow that could step into the light at any moment and evict the trespassers. Late that evening, Brian came home carrying a giant teddy bear for Lucy, presenting himself as a loving father. Lucy accepted it with a faint smile, but her eyes betrayed hesitation. She glanced at her mother, silently asking permission to accept a gift from a lying father. Clara nodded slightly. The performance would continue, just a little longer. Brian collapsed on the couch, rubbing his legs, bragging about how successful his business meeting had been thanks to Clara's money. He promised profits would double next month. He promised a family vacation to Europe by year's end. Clara listened quietly while folding laundry. Brian had no idea what was happening behind his back. He didn't know his secret investment house had changed hands. He didn't know every dollar he spent was now under legal surveillance. And most importantly, he didn't know the quiet woman sitting before him held absolute control over his fate. Clara handed him a cup of warm tea. As Brian sipped it contentedly, Clara smiled, mysterious and calm. Enjoy this peace while you can, she thought. The real storm is already waiting at the door. Late that night, Clara stared at the calendar on her bedroom wall. Sunday was only 2 days away. She circled the date in her mind with red ink. Sunday would no longer be a day of fake workouts and lies. Sunday would be execution day. She had prepared the final scenario. Brian would not go alone again. She would take Brian and Lucy to the party. The real surprise. Clara turned off the bedroom light, letting darkness fill the room, while the fire in her chest burned brighter than ever. She could hardly wait to see Brian's face when his mask was torn away in front of everyone. Her patience had reached its limit, and now the shadow owner was ready to step into the light to reclaim everything that was hers. The sharp scent of vanilla perfume mixed with musk clung to Brian's body. A smell that now made Clara's stomach churn every time she breathed it in. Brian was crouched on the front porch tying his shoelaces when Clara stepped outside, not in casual home clothes, but in an elegant semi-formal outfit, complete with a shimmering satin shawl draped neatly around her shoulders. She stood in the doorway, staring at her husband's back with a cold gaze carefully hidden behind a sweet smile. She called Brian's name softly yet firmly. Brian turned around, visibly startled by how polished his wife looked this early in the morning. Before he could ask a question or say goodbye, Clara launched her first strike. She told him that today he had to cancel his plan to go to the gym. Calmly, she explained that she had just received wonderful news from her office the previous afternoon. Her annual bonus and a profit distribution from the company cooperative had been released, and the amount was enormous, far beyond expectations. Clara lied flawlessly. She said she wanted to celebrate by taking Brian and Lucy to a special lunch at a luxury restaurant, then visit a property site because she intended to invest the bonus money that very day. The moment Brian heard the words large bonus and investment, his eyes lit up. Greed immediately overpowered logic. Meeting Sandra dropped to second place in his priorities. If Clara had a lot of money, Brian needed to be there, at the very least to charm her into letting some of it flow back into his pockets under the excuse of business capital. Brian tried to play hard to get, pretending to hesitate because it would disrupt his workout schedule. Clara cut him off smoothly. She said that if Brian didn't want to come along, she would go by herself and might even buy an apartment without consulting him first. The subtle threat worked. Brian immediately agreed. He dropped his gym bag and hurried back into the bedroom to change into something more appropriate. Clara waited in the living room holding Lucy's hand. Lucy looked lovely in a simple pink party dress. The little girl asked where they were going. Clara leaned down and whispered that they were going to see a dream house and meet someone. Lucy nodded innocently, unaware that she was about to witness the collapse of her father's charade. A few minutes later, Brian emerged wearing a short-sleeved patterned shirt, looking neat and handsome. He smiled broadly, wrapping an arm around Clara and Lucy, playing the role of the perfect family man. They walked toward the car. When Brian reached for the driver's seat, Clara stopped him. She asked for the car keys, saying she would drive since she knew the restaurant and property locations. Brian handed them over without protest, assuming Clara simply wanted to spoil him today. The car merged into the moderately busy Sunday traffic. At first, Brian seemed relaxed, whistling softly along with the radio, occasionally sneaking messages on his phone, probably sending excuses to Sandra. But the relaxed mood slowly faded when Clara steered the car not toward the city center where luxury restaurants were located, but toward the outskirts. Brian shifted uneasily in his seat. He asked confused why they were heading that way. Without looking at him, Clara replied calmly that there was a new upscale restaurant in a developing area and the property she wanted to see was nearby. The explanation sounded reasonable. Still, Brian's instincts began sounding alarm bells. His anxiety peaked when the car passed a very familiar intersection. This was the route he took every week to reach Sandra's house. Cold sweat beaded at his temples. He tried to change the subject, suggesting they turn around and eat at a nearby mall since Lucy must be hungry. Clara declined gently, saying they were already close. She drove with complete focus while the corner of her eye caught every sign of Brian's growing panic. His fingers began tapping rapidly against his knee, a clear sign of extreme nervousness. He was surely praying the car would simply pass through. It didn't. Clara switched on the right turn signal and drove straight into the grand gates of Rosewood residence. Brian's face drained of color, as if all the blood had been sucked out of him. He turned sharply toward Clara, his voice trembling as he asked why they were entering this place. Clara remained calm. She said flatly that the property she wanted to buy was inside this complex, citing its excellent investment prospects. Brian fell silent. He was trapped. He couldn't forbid her from entering, it would be suspicious, but going in meant a massive risk of being exposed. He could only hope Sandra wasn't home or that Clara would look at another block far away. That hope shattered. When Clara drove straight down the main boulevard, the block where Sandra lived, Brian's breathing grew shallow and labored. He clutched the door handle tightly. Clara could feel the fear radiating from his body, and it gave her a quiet satisfaction. The car slowed and finally stopped in front of a house with lush hedges and a white swing on the porch. Sandra's house. Clara turned off the engine. Silence swallowed the car. Brian froze, staring at the house in horror. Clara turned to him, smiling meaningfully. "This is the house I told you about," she said calmly, "our future investment home." She stepped out of the car gracefully and walked around to open the door for Lucy. Brian remained frozen in the passenger seat like a statue. He was paralyzed by fear. If he stayed inside, Clara would grow suspicious. If he stepped out, he was finished. Clara tapped on the window, gesturing for him to get out. With stiff, trembling movements, Brian finally opened the door. His legs felt like jelly. He stood beside the car, his eyes darting around, praying Sandra wouldn't come outside. The midday sun burned his skin, but the sweat soaking his back was pure terror. Suddenly, the front door opened. Brian's heart nearly stopped. Sandra appeared in the doorway. She looked beautiful in a loose house dress, her pregnant belly unmistakable. Seeing Brian's car parked outside, she smiled broadly, assuming her lover had arrived as usual. She hadn't noticed who else was there, hidden by the fence pillars. Sandra stepped onto the porch, calling out Brian's name with a playful, affectionate nickname. Her voice rang clearly in the ears of Clara, Lucy, and Brian. That endearment echoed in the air like undeniable proof. Sandra stopped abruptly mid-path when her eyes caught someone other than Brian. A woman standing tall, neatly dressed with a shawl, her gaze sharp, and a small child beside her. Sandra's smile vanished, replaced by confusion and caution. She looked at Brian, demanding an explanation with her eyes. Brian stood in the middle, between his legal wife and his mistress, like a condemned man awaiting execution. He opened his mouth, perhaps to produce another lie. Nothing came out. Panic strangled his voice. Clara stepped forward. She didn't scream, she didn't cry, she didn't pull hair. With the composure of a queen inspecting commoners, Clara held Lucy's hand and approached the gate. She looked Sandra straight in the eyes, politely but coldly. Clara greeted her and introduced herself. "My name is Clara." Sandra gasped. That name was far from unfamiliar. Brian had spoken about Clara many times, lies fed carefully. He had painted Clara as cruel, demanding, old, unattractive, and already in the process of divorce. But the woman standing before Sandra now was nothing like that image. Clara looked young, elegant, composed, and powerful. Feeling threatened, Sandra immediately went on the defensive. She crossed her arms, sneered at Clara, then turned her fury on Brian. She yelled, demanding to know why he had brought his wife and child here. She accused him of being brainless and ruining her peace. Sandra believed she was the victim of Brian's broken promises. She believed she had a rightful claim to the house. After all, Brian had told her it was bought specifically for the two of them. The argument erupted, but not between Clara and Sandra. It was Sandra attacking Brian. Brian could only bow his head, raising his hands in futile attempts to calm her, whispering for her to stop making a scene because the neighbors might see. In the chaos, Lucy tugged at Clara's hand. The little girl pointed at Sandra and whispered loudly, "She's the vanilla-smelling lady I told you about." Then she pointed at the porch swing. "That's the swing I sat on when I waited for Daddy to buy gas." Lucy's innocent confession poured gasoline on the fire. Clara gently stroked Lucy's head, confirming her words. Then Clara looked back at Sandra. She took a slim folder from her handbag. Calmly, she opened the unlocked gate and stepped into the yard. She held the documents to Sandra. In a flat voice, Clara said Sandra was mistaken in one thing. She wasn't here to take Brian back. She didn't want him anymore. She was here to inspect her property. Sandra frowned, confused. She snatched. Sandra's face turned pale, just as pale as Brian's. She glared at him furiously and screamed, "How could this house possibly belong to your wife?" Brian lifted his head, shocked beyond belief. He had no idea about any of this. His eyes locked onto Clara, with disbelief written all over his face. Clara merely smirked. In a calm, almost casual tone, she explained that since the mortgage payments had been overdue for months because the money had been used for who knows what, the developer had sold the disputed property, and she, Clara, had purchased it outright in cash. Legally speaking, Sandra was now trespassing in Clara's house without permission. Then Clara delivered an ultimatum that shattered the mental state of the two betrayers. She told Sandra she had exactly 1 hour to pack her personal belongings and leave the house. If she failed to do so, Clara would call the Rosewood Residence Security Patrol to forcibly remove her on charges of illegal occupation of private property. Sandra exploded into hysterical rage. She felt utterly deceived by Brian. She began pounding his chest with her clenched fists, cursing him a poor fraud who owned nothing. Sandra screamed that she had only agreed to be with Brian because he had promised her a life of luxury, only to find out that everything had been paid for with his wife's money. The mask of love shattered completely, revealing Sandra's true materialistic nature. Brian could only stand there and take the blows. His pride was destroyed in front of his lawful wife and their child. He tried to grab Sandra's hand, but she slapped it away harshly. Sandra ran into the house, wailing loudly, and began throwing things around in frustration. Clara stood still, watching the drama unfold with indescribable satisfaction. She had successfully turned them against each other using nothing but the truth. She looked at Brian, now standing alone on the terrace, small, pitiful, and utterly broken. Brian turned to Clara, tears welling up in his eyes as he begged for mercy. He tried to approach her, calling her name, reaching for her hand. Clara stepped back. She looked at him with pure disgust, as if staring at a piece of trash. Firmly, she said the show was over. No more games, no more fake investments, and no more marriage. Clara pointed toward the gated entrance of Rosewood Residence, where a white and blue police patrol car, already contacted earlier by Mr. Harrison, was now approaching. The wailing siren shattered the midday silence of the upscale residential complex, intensifying the already suffocating tension. The sound grew louder and closer, like background music for the collapse of the small kingdom Brian had built on lies. Brian stood frozen on the terrace of the luxurious house. His face was deathly pale. Cold sweat poured down his forehead, soaking his patterned dress shirt. His legs trembled violently, as if the bones within them were dissolving one by one. He stared at the patrol car as it slowly stopped behind Clara's vehicle. 2 uniformed officers stepped out with stern expressions, followed by a man in a neatly tailored suit, someone Brian knew all too well. It was Mr. Harrison, the senior attorney for Clara's family, a man Brian had once dismissed as a boring old guardian. Now, Mr. Harrison looked like the Grim Reaper himself. Clara remained calm in the yard, one hand held tightly onto little Lucy's, while the other rested elegantly on her handbag. She showed not the slightest hint of panic. On the contrary, she looked like a director calmly watching the climax of a movie she had written herself. She gazed at Brian, now resembling a cornered rat. All traces of his former arrogance and fake authority were gone, replaced with raw fear. Brian attempted to step back, his eyes darting for an escape route, but there was nowhere to run. In front of him were the police and his wife, armed with evidence. Behind him was a house that no longer sheltered him. Beside him stood a high fence impossible to climb. Mr. Harrison approached with confident strides, holding a thick red folder. He nodded respectfully to Clara before turning his sharp gaze toward Brian over the rim of his glasses. He wasted no time on pleasantries. In a loud, formal voice, Mr. Harrison explained the reason for law enforcement's presence. Brian had been reported for alleged embezzlement of corporate funds amounting to several $1 million, falsification of financial documents, and asset fraud. Brian attempted to speak, to claim it was all a misunderstanding, that he could explain everything, but the words stuck in his throat. He knew the documents he had signed without reading a few days ago were a deadly trap. They weren't just approval forms for fund withdrawals. They were formal acknowledgments of debt and a transfer of full criminal liability for the illegal use of company money. Suddenly, chaos erupted from inside the house. The front door flew open. Sandra emerged with a swollen face and makeup streaked by tears. She dragged a large suitcase with difficulty while carrying several luxury shopping bags spilling their contents. She looked nothing like the glamorous woman she had always pretended to be. When she saw the police, Sandra froze. Her eyes widened in shock as she looked from Brian to the officers and finally to Clara. Reality hit her hard. This was no longer just about being kicked out by a legal wife. This was a criminal matter. Cunning and selfish as ever, Sandra immediately realized she needed to save herself. She slammed the suitcase to the ground and hurried toward the police. In a shrill, dramatic voice, she began screaming that she was a victim too, pointing an accusing finger at Brian, claiming he had deceived her, posing as a wealthy single man and promising her a luxurious life. She swore she knew nothing about the source of his money, portraying herself as a weak woman who had been manipulated by a womanizer. Brian's heart shattered even further. The woman he had spoiled, the woman he had bought a house for using stolen money from his wife, discarded him the moment the ship began to sink. Clara merely smiled faintly at the spectacle. She stepped closer to Sandra and coldly reminded her that the luxury items inside those branded bags had been purchased with Clara's company funds. Technically, they were stolen assets. Clara warned Sandra to leave all valuable items behind, or she would be charged as a receiver of stolen goods. Sandra's face went white. She looked at her designer bags, then at the handcuffs hanging from the officer's belt. Fear of prison finally overpowered greed. With an angry stomp, she threw the bags to the ground, spat in Brian's direction, and stormed out the gate with nothing but the clothes on her back and unbearable shame. Now it was Brian's turn. The officers approached and instructed him to cooperate. He stepped back until his spine hit a pillar wall. Tears streamed down his face, not from genuine remorse, but from sheer terror of what awaited him. In his final moment of desperation, Brian saw Lucy. His 5-year-old daughter stood quietly beside Clara. His manipulative instincts resurfaced. Brian suddenly dropped to his knees on the hard terrace floor and crawled toward Clara and Lucy, raising his trembling hands in supplication. He rambled incoherently, invoking God, love, and most disgustingly, using his daughter's name as a shield. He begged Clara not to send him to prison for Lucy's future, asking how Lucy would feel growing up without a father. He pleaded to remember the early days of their marriage. He even tried to grab Clara's feet, attempting to kiss the tip of her shoe. The sight was pitiful. A man who only hours ago believed himself king, juggling 2 women, now crawled like a beggar before the woman he betrayed. Clara did not step back. She stood firm like a rock. She pulled Lucy gently behind her, shielding her from Brian's reach. Then she spoke coldly. Brian had no right to mention Lucy's name ever again. He chose this path when he lied every Sunday, when he stole his daughter's college fund to buy a house for another woman. Lucy's future, Clara said, would be far better without a father who was a liar and a thief. Brian shook his head hysterically, still begging. Then something unforgettable happened. Lucy released her mother's hand and stepped forward, just one small step. She looked at her father's tear-soaked face without pity. Only deep disappointment filled her eye. The sharp, metallic clang echoed as the handcuffs snapped shut around his wrists. Click. That sound marked the end of Brian's freedom. The officers read Brian his rights as a suspect while escorting him toward the patrol car. He walked with his head bowed low, unable to bring himself to look at Clara or Lucy ever again. Neighbors throughout Rosewood residents began stepping out of their homes, watching the scene with hushed whispers and curious stares. Brian's reputation as a wealthy, respected resident shattered within minutes, replaced by the humiliating image of a criminal being arrested in public. The police car slowly pulled away from the driveway, carrying Brian toward the precinct to face the consequences of his actions. Clara exhaled deeply, so deeply it felt as though she were releasing a burden weighing thousands of tons from her chest. An overwhelming sense of relief washed over her. Mr. Harrison gently patted her shoulder, offering a supportive smile before excusing himself to handle the remaining legal procedures at the police station. Now, only Clara and Lucy remained in the yard of the luxurious house. A house that had once symbolized betrayal was now fully under her control. Clara looked at the grand structure. There was no pain left in her gaze, only the calm assessment of a property she now managed. She crouched down, wrapped Lucy in a tight embrace, and kissed the top of her head. The storm had passed. Though it left ruins behind, the air now felt clean, free from the pollution of lies. 6 months later, time, as always, proved to be the most effective healer. The wheel of life continued to turn, grinding destinies according to one's own actions. On a bright morning beneath a vast, cloudless blue sky, the backyard of the Rosewood residence house looked completely transformed. The only tall, closed-off hedges had been neatly trimmed, making the house feel open and welcoming. The exterior walls, previously painted a dull beige chosen by Sandra, were now coated in crisp white, giving the house a modern, spacious feel. There was no trace of the dark past left behind. In the private backyard pool, crystal blue water shimmered under the morning sun. The sound of splashing water and a child's laughter filled the air. Clara and Lucy were enjoying precious time together. This was not a crowded public pool, reeking of harsh chlorine like before. This was their private pool. Clara wore a bright-colored, modest swimwear. Her face looked fresh and radiant. The dark circles under her eyes, once caused by sleepless nights haunted by her husband's lies, were gone. Her beauty had returned, now accompanied by the quiet charisma of a self-made woman fully in control of her life. Lucy, now nearly 6 years old, swam happily using a donut-shaped float. Her laughter rang freely, unburdened. Clara sat on the edge of the pool, her feet dangling in the cool water. She sipped a glass of fresh orange juice while watching Lucy play. Her thoughts drifted briefly to the events 6 months earlier. The divorce process had moved swiftly, with solid evidence of infidelity, abandonment, and criminal acts. The court granted Clara's divorce petition in the very first hearing. Full custody of Lucy was awarded to her without contest. Brian was powerless to fight back. He was found guilty of embezzlement and fraud and is now serving his sentence in a state correctional facility. His remaining assets were seized to compensate the company's losses, leaving him completely bankrupt. The last Clara heard, even Brian's extended family refused to visit him out of shame. Sandra's fate was not much better. After being expelled from the house, Sandra attempted to claim child support for the baby she was carrying, hoping to secure financial assistance from Brian. But with Brian imprisoned and penniless, she received not a single dollar. Rumors spread that Sandra had fallen deep into online loan debt to sustain her uncontrollable lifestyle and was now hiding in her hometown, doing odd jobs to support her baby. Clara felt no pity, but she no longer carried resentment. She considered them both part of her past, a costly lesson in the true price of honesty. Karma worked in its own perfect and fair way. Clara chose not to sell the Rosewood residence house. Instead, she renovated it into a weekend shelter and reading garden for orphaned children, while also keeping it as a private villa for Clara and Lucy. She wanted to transform the negative energy of the house into something meaningful. The white porch swing, once a symbol of stolen dreams, had become the favorite spot for orphaned children to play and read storybooks. Each time Clara saw their joyful laughter, she felt victorious. She had reclaimed her dream, cleansed it of its stains, and turned it into something far more meaningful than a luxurious showpiece. "Mom, look, I can dive now," Lucy shouted, breaking Clara's thoughts. She demonstrated her breath-holding skills underwater, resurfacing with a wet face and wiping her eyes. Clara clapped enthusiastically, praising her daughter, making Lucy beam with pride. Lucy swam closer and held on to the pool's edge. Suddenly, her expression grew serious. She looked at her mother and asked innocently, "Mom, where is Daddy? Why doesn't he ever swim with us anymore?" The question was natural for a child Lucy's age. Perhaps she had begun to miss the idea of a father. Clara set down her juice, gently wiped Lucy's wet cheek, and met her eyes calmly. She did not avoid the question. She did not lie. Clara had promised herself she would always be honest with her child, using words a child could understand. "Daddy is learning, sweetheart," she said softly. "He's in a special place for people who need to learn how to be good again. Daddy has to fix the mistakes he made." She didn't use the frightening word prison, but she also didn't create false hope by saying he was working or on vacation. Lucy thought for a moment, then nodded. "Oh, like when Lucy is naughty and has to sit quietly in a chair?" she asked innocently. Clara chuckled. "Yes, something like that, but for much longer, because Daddy's mistakes were bigger." Lucy didn't ask any more questions. She seemed satisfied. For her, living with a mother who was always present, always honest, and always joyful was more than enough. Lucy pushed herself away from the pool's edge and resumed playing happily. Clara tilted her head back, gazing at the sky. The sunlight felt warm on her face. She took a deep breath, inhaling the fresh morning air, free from suffocating vanilla perfume, free from the stench of lies. Her life felt light now. Her business was thriving under her own honest management. Her assets were secure, and most importantly, she possessed peace and happiness beyond any price. Clara realized that Sundays were no longer gloomy days. Sundays were now her victory. She grabbed her sunglasses, slipped them casually on, and leaned back on the lounge chair. "Come on, Mom, get in the water," Lucy called, splashing water toward her. "Ready, Princess," Clara replied with laughter. She stood up and jumped into the pool, sending a huge splash into the air. Their laughter echoed loudly, marking the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with hope and honesty. Clara knew that no matter how fierce the storm had once been, the sun would always shine again for those brave enough to walk in truth. And this morning, the sun shone brilliantly for Clara and Lucy. Sun.